Hello, and welcome to this edition of Cherry Bekaert's Not-for-Profit Podcast. This is the place where we talk about all variety of matters impacting not-for-profit organizations. This is your host, Matthew Socha speaking. I am the not-for-profit industry practice leader for Cherry Bekaert, and I am very happy to be joined by our guest today, Steve Ursillo. Steve is the leader of Cherry Bekaert's Cybersecurity group. Steve, welcome to the podcast. It is great to have you with us.
Thanks, Matt. Pleasure to be here.
Great. Well, the subject of today's conversation is this Blackbaud ransomware that recently made the news. It was a ransomware and data breach. And Steve, as you know, Blackbaud is a market leader in not-for-profit fundraising and accounting software. So this breach appears to have had a pretty broad impact. In fact, a lot of our clients have reached out to us with questions, wanting some advice. Pretty much anyone that does not-for-profit fundraising activity might use this software. And we know that this cyber criminal out there copied some of Blackbaud's customer data, including things that are a little bit concerning, like donor names and addresses and their contact information and how much they've given to the organization. This according to information that we've received from our clients. So, Steve, a lot of information here, but I know that you've read Blackbaud's response. When I read it, it sort of looks like they're on top of everything. They say, we have no reason to believe that any of the data went beyond the cyber criminal. I'm just curious, when you read it, how do you interpret, Blackbaud's response from a cybersecurity expert's point of view?
Well, thanks, Matt. And it's certainly unfortunate, to see these types of, incidents and breaches that are happening out there. Unfortunately, it's become kind of the new norm. Breach fatigue is certainly something we're all experiencing as it pertains to third parties having to report it and everything else that goes along with that response. Ultimately, I think the response was fairly well orchestrated. Most of all the requirements that are typically needed legally as it pertains to breach notification were covered through that response. And I think ultimately it comes down to the customers and the user organizations to evaluate what that means for them. In other words, what type of data did that provider have? What was involved? And based on the information that was provided, what response and obligations do they have to the actual data subjects or the people that they collect the data from, right? And typically that's something that's going to be orchestrated through, identifying the appropriate team, having legal representation, and making sure that your incident response program clearly identifies an action program for how you're going to respond to that. Each state regulatory body, domestic and international group out there, and contracts that you may have with these providers is going to really prescribe the breach notification timeline and what needs to be communicated. And ultimately that response seemed to cover the measures that they needed to so that organizations can think about what impact that had on them.
Yeah, and so Blackbaud, we know Blackbaud, obviously a big tech company, probably has a bunch of lawyers and folks jumping on top of this, I would assume. If I'm at a small not-for-profit organization, and I get notice of this breach that some of my data has been compromised or potentially compromised, what's my first response? I might not have in-house counsel and a chief technology officer and so forth. So where do not-for-profit organizations begin to respond, in the immediate and also in the long term? Where do they go from here?
Yeah, it's a great question, Matt. I think that ultimately the answer is going to be predicated based on the cyber maturity of the group that it impacted. So organizations that have a bit more of a mature cyber incident response program hopefully have a little bit more of an advantage from a well-orchestrated execution timeline, lessons learned, and what they need to do. Others that are a little bit more ad hoc may struggle to do the right things in the time period that is prescribed, right? The breach notification requirements are, in some cases, 72 hours. They're only giving you a couple of days to act and notify. So ultimately, it's important for the organization to think about not if, but when something like this happens and what's that going to mean. Knowing what, where they're going to point to for legal representation. Do they have the insurance company information that they can notify and put them on notice for a claim, what resources are going to be kind of given to them, either through the insurance company with references to legal and forensic folks, or whether they have their own, consultants and other advisors that can help them through that. Is the coverage going to be adequate? How do they prescribe the response to their customers if, in fact, their customers' data was part of that service provider's breach? Those are all things that need to be considered. In many cases, too, from a proactive perspective, these organizations need to be evaluating their third-party relationships. Supply chain and vendor management relationships are something that we see, and organizations are trying to shift the risk associated with those third parties, but they need to understand the risk of doing that, the type of data, the controls that they have, and measure up, how they can protect the data, but also how they would cooperate in the response of something happening like this to make sure they can action it appropriately.
That's great, Steve, and certainly good advice. And I know that you've helped a lot of different types of organizations in many industries, but you've worked in the not-for-profit industry before with clients of all different sizes. And I'm curious, when you go into kind of a consulting arrangement like that, and you're looking to help organizations really bring the maturity of those controls up. Is there something that you see as sort of a most common deficiency, or is it a multitude of things when you're working with not-for-profits? I'm sure you get this question all the time.
We do. We actually get this question not only just for not-for-profits, but other industries as well. Certainly try to do as much as you can from a risk-based approach to focus your attention on what's going to give you kind of the overall best residual risk mitigation. But ultimately, it comes down to your information security program. The more formalized it is, the more repeatable it's going to be, the more it's going to be orchestrated, and there's accountability there. Sometimes when things are ad hoc, people get busy and things fall through the cracks. So how often is that organization doing their risk assessments? How often are they doing their vulnerability assessments and their penetration testing? So in other words, are they consistently looking for these high-risk components? Are they looking for new and emerging vulnerabilities? And do they have somebody trying to really do what the attackers are doing on a regular basis, so that all the low-hanging fruit is basically, out of reach for some of those adversaries? Those are important parts. There's other key components as far as making sure that systems are updated and protected, authentication and access control, multi-factor authentication. All of those things become, key parts of controls for organizations to make sure that they're safeguarding data. Training and awareness becomes really important as well. Obviously, the attackers are going to go after the weakest link, which in many cases is the users. So they're using that as an attack vector to get around some of the more sophisticated controls. And then, of course, not only just the prevention, but the detection, response, and recovery through your incident response program, your event logging, and really trying to determine in a post-breach mentality world, or an assumed breach mentality world, meaning it's not if, it's when attackers get on the network. How do we pick them up as soon as they get in there? And that's really what we're looking to achieve here.
Yeah. So if I'm hearing you right, there is no silver bullet. There is no one control in place. It really sounds like it's the culmination of a lot of little things that makes it sort of difficult for these cyber criminals to get in and get annoyed before they just move on to the easier guys, right?
Think about an analogy of your house. You're locking doors, you're locking windows. If you leave a window open or a door open, that's an opportunity regardless of how good the other controls are. Or maybe you lock a door, but it's not latched properly. So you need to understand kind of where those threats and risks are and have somebody looking at that on a regular basis to try to mitigate.
Steve, that's great advice. I appreciate that analogy. Well, thank you for your time today, Steve. Really appreciate your expertise and your insight on this subject matter. This isn't the first breach that's happened. I'm sure it will not be the last. And I'm sure you would agree that any listeners of this podcast who are dealing with their own cybersecurity issues should, of course, reach out to Steve, reach out to myself, and we'll be happy to help you deal with it. So thanks for joining us, Steve. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Matt. It was a pleasure. Thanks again.
All right. So long.